Naomi Baylor, and I, along with my colleagues, Mike Reed and Lucia and others, help run the Decolonizing Global Health Working Group here at the Institute for Global Health Sciences, which is part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And we have been convening this speaker series, this series of events for the past year or so on decolonizing global health. And our goal with the series is really to create space for learning and reflection and conversation about what that means, what decolonizing global health means, what it entails, and how institutions like our own, like UCSF, like the UC system more broadly, can rethink about the way that we do education and research in global health to actually create the type of equitable communities that we say is at the core of our mission, but then often might not live up to in practice. And so we have our speaker series every month. And for those who are interested, we have recordings of all our past speaker series on the UCSF IGHS webpage, so feel free to visit and hear from our past speakers. And I also just wanted to say that a lot of our conversations have been really hearing from speakers from around the world and thinking about the global health aspect of decolonization. But of course, colonialism didn't only happen in other countries, it happened here and is continuing to be something that we're struggling with in our own country. And of course, other systems of violence and white supremacy that are related to and very deeply interconnected with colonialism are things that we're also continuing to try to figure out as a society. So just wanted to acknowledge the context that we're working in today as well. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. Naya Jones, who is joining us from University of California, Santa Cruz. And Dr. Jones is a critical geographer and cultural worker who uses arts-based methods to study Black geographies of health, ecologies, and healing in North and Latin America. Her current book project considers how Black ecological knowledge beyond the American South continues to be reimagined amid ongoing spatial injustice, including the uneven effects of climate change. She works closely with community-based organizations, gardeners, and traditional healers to archive these relational ways of knowing for local and global futures. Naya is a former National Culture of Health leader, a program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and is an Assistant Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz, where she is also a core faculty in the Global and Community Health program. She also co-facilitates the UC Santa Cruz Black Geographies Lab and is the founding director of the newly emerging Black Botany Studio. So with that, welcome Naya to our speaker series, and I'm going to give the floor over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I have been teaching remotely for 2 years, maybe some of you as well. And so one way I like to just get a sense of who's present with us, who's in the space. If you know how to use your reactions, your emojis, feel free at any time during the conversation. Oh, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Naomi. Oh my gosh, there's a celebration from Brianna. What a beautiful name. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I see a worm from perhaps Linnea. Maya, there's claps, and there's a heart from Robert. Thank you, Leah, as well. Claps from Carla. Okay. So hello, everyone. And I might ask for that, just invite you for a few times as we move into today. And 2 hearts from Stacy. Okay, we have an active and present group. Thank you all. So I'm really excited to join you. Thank you, Mike, Naomi, for the invitation. And I'm really excited to be here, and at the same time, aware of the relevance of this work in whole other ways today. So I want to be very honest with you that if I lose my train of thought, if I seem a little fatigued or tired at any point, I'm still reeling, and perhaps you are as well, reeling from the white supremacist violence on Saturday. It's very close to my communities with whom I work, Black communities with whom I work, Black family members, and also just very close to the research that I do as well. So I'll touch on that. And I wanted to really start there and with an image as well. I want to acknowledge that in moving in this work, I also move relationally, and I'm always practicing allyship and co-conspiratorship. So we also experienced the mass shooting in Laguna Woods and anti-Taiwanese hate as well recently, right? So there's so much going on. And to Naomi's point at the very beginning, what does this all tell us about white supremacy? And what are we learning about how people thrive in through anyway? This is where I'm really excited to dwell with you. So I'm going to put up an initial image and really just take a moment together to pause, enter the space. Maybe you notice different colors here. This is Romari Bearden's, one of Romari Bearden's amazing artists' work, collage, paint work, such a sense of texture. I appreciate Bearden's work because of the focus on Black gardening and relationships with nature, the many dimensions of the work. When I'm teaching classes, part of my decolonial praxis is that students and I will often work with or witness a piece of work, piece of artwork or a poem or something else to kind of open us up into the classroom and conversation. What we'll usually do, we won't do it today here together, but we'll often put observations in chat. And I'll ask again and again, and maybe 3 times, what the students notice. It's such a powerful practice, fills up the chat. So it's a great teaching strategy as well, side note, and also really brings us into the space together. So pausing here 1 moment, I'm going to be quiet for one brief moment, and maybe you'll be quiet with me. So I have a couple of bullet points here too. So in order to honor this moment in which we're living, recognizing the fullness of it and recent tragedies and legacies of white supremacy so very manifest, there is a superb press release from Black food activists in Buffalo and Black-led organizations that I'll share with you in case you haven't seen it yet. If you have seen it, give us a sense with emojis if you have seen this press release. It's a really excellent advisory that gives a sense of press advisory, that gives a sense of the context that led to even having economic disinvestment, right, in the east side of Buffalo. And it also holds up different ways to support food activists on the ground there. I also want to highlight, and I'll share with you some of my research that delves into racial trauma, slow violence, and Black food geographies. When I was doing some of my research I won't necessarily delve into today, I started to notice that Black folks and community members with whom I was conducting research about just going to the grocery store would often talk about feeling as if they were under surveillance or being racially profiled. And so some of the work that I've done and the writing that I've done has been around healing racial trauma, resilience, careful using that word in a really deep sense of that word, and Black food geographies. Unfortunately, as I said, This work is not only relevant, but continues to be evergreen for those of you who build websites or do virtual kind of work. The day that that work is not evergreen, we won't need to have the Decolonizing Global Health series, right? So those will be available to you after this talk too. You all, I wanted to give some context to what I'll share with you here today, because I'll really share more about the gardening work and research, but also from a meta kind of perspective, a way of, okay, how to reimagine that work, not just this is what I'm doing in the field, but how to reimagine and think through doing that work in a way that really practices decolonizing global health. I'll also talk about the Black Botany Studio and decolonial strategies for pedagogy. But before I do that, I wanted to give a sense of the journey. Right? I might not read this whole kind of timeline exactly, but what I do want to highlight is one, my BA, I was a first generation college and graduate student. My BA, dreams of being an English professor, was very much in humanities. And so you'll notice that when I'm paying attention, I think too, to artwork, I'm very interested in archives and text as part of the social science research that I also do. In 2007 is really when I started turning to Black botanical medicine as a research subject and topic, because immediately, the immediate sense was, well, this is really interesting. There are Afro-descendant populations in Mexico. Right? That was my initial thought. As someone who's African-American and Chicana, Black and Black Chicana, this was a revelation, right? So I grew up in Texas, where at that time, right, at that time and growing up in the 80s, we didn't have, a lot of these conversations about Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latina identity. We didn't have amazing work by so many of these Black, Blaxican, Afro-Latinx artists. And so at this time, I was also very personally interested, right, in Afrodescendientes in Mexico, and also very interested in botanical medicine. So I studied gardens at that time in the context of Central Veracruz, really paying attention to, okay, what's happening in this community outside Jalapa, the capital of Veracruz, with botanical plant knowledge, especially because the community received its first biomedical clinic in 1982. So in the tradition of ethnobotanical, botanical research, looking at transmission of knowledge, what's sustained, what's maintained, what happens when people have access to biomedicine, right? I really paid attention to that in that research. There was a gap, a time where I was really focusing on what I wanted to do with my life, working with young people, doing social work, and then I returned to for my PhD in geography and the environment at University of Texas at Austin. And this is where I really started to explore less extractive, hopefully, right, research methods related broadly to health and well-being, this time the Black diaspora in the United States. So the young Black folks, teenagers with whom I was working, were sharing with me about their lived experiences about food in their gentrifying neighborhood. These were youth who were African-American, also Black and Mexican, Black and Guatemalan, so Black in an expansive sense, right, of the word. We also practiced participatory research and film together. And so they interviewed family members and also learned more about how to create films, right? How to document their own lived experiences. This was really powerful work, really intensive work over the course of about 4 years. This brings me closer to the present, and this is where I'll land. With the postdoc at the Medical College of Wisconsin is when I really started focusing again more on Black botanical medicine, Black holistic health and healing. Food geographies, food sovereignty, in the work that I'm doing and understanding it is very much botanical as well. But I've moved a bit more towards what I was practicing looking at in 2007 again. And that's what you'll hear during this talk. I want to highlight that, as Naomi shared, I'm a researcher, I'm also a cultural worker. So when I'm talking with community members who say, practice Black holistic health and healing, we're also practicing as talking and in conversation as fellow practitioners. Right? Of course, well, maybe it's not quite evident, but it's very evident when I'm doing and practicing research, that this means that I'm navigating research while also being part of communities in different ways. Right? As a Black practitioner, cultural worker, working with fellow Black practitioners and Black-led organizations, and also balancing, bridging theory and practice. So what about decolonizing global health, question mark? I'll talk a bit about research and pedagogy here. How are we doing? Are folks with me? Are you with me? Emojis, any sense? I'm seeing a nod from Naomi, okay. Any emojis? And I see, okay, great. I'm seeing, okay, Stacy, thank you. I can see some folks on my screen, okay. Research. So, go back here. This research that I conducted in 2007 that I'm also picking up and working with in different ways still, in a lot of ways was carried out in a way that I would not carry it out today. So I'm going to give, instead of findings from that research, I really want to talk about some of what I practice and some of the repair that I'm practicing now. Because my sense from talking with Naomi and Mike too, was that there's an interest in process, right? I mean, what does decolonizing global health look like, not only in theory, but in practice, right? So what I practiced might be familiar to some of you who practice ethnobotanical, or I'll just call it botanical research. I gathered voucher specimens of plants, took them to the amazing herbarium in Jalapa for plant identification. So we could see, okay, what is the Latin name for this plant? Also took into account the common name for the different plants from the garden. So this is one garden from that Afro-Mexican context. Many of the gardeners were women. Many of the knowledge keepers were women, and this is very common in ethnobotanical research too, in this rural context. You can see the use of different buckets, containers to grow different kinds of plants, trees, herbs. Weedy species were very important and very prevalent around the edges of fields, thoroughfares, fallow fields. At the same time, as I started to write this up for my thesis, it's my MA thesis, I started to wonder, wait a minute, what am I doing? Who is my audience, right? With whom do I share this knowledge? Do I want to publish this? All of these existential, important methodological questions came up. Should I have engaged with them sooner? Yes, in an ideal world, but I had not. Right? So now these are the questions that I've really been exploring over the past decade plus, right, since that work. What plants do Black diaspora communities use, cultivate, and seek? How does this botanical knowledge remain central to everyday living, healthcare, healing, medicinal practices, social movements? What ways of knowing or epistemologies undergird this knowledge? What are the philosophies, right, not just the practices? And making sure, yes. And then I'll share with you some questions I started to have around method, right? So giving you a sense of what kind of questions started to emerge from that field work. But let's also talk about the assumptions, because in terms of decolonizing, I feel like so much of what I do and what I'm involved in my work is calling out and making explicit assumptions in conventional research about Black botanical knowledge, right? About Black communities, period, but also about Black botanical knowledge. So what assumptions am I making here based on how I am moving in this research? And I'm going to highlight some of those and where they come from. So some of the assumptions I'm making, and in the interest of decolonizing the work, right? One is that Black diaspora communities cultivate, maintain, and practice knowledge. Right? This is also really key work that's being done by Judith Carney, Robert Vokes, John Rashford, other scholars in geography, botany, they might call it ethnobotany. Oftentimes in this work, there's an emphasis on continuity. Some of you may be familiar with that word. In Black studies, that emphasis on what was carried forward and maintained through and despite beyond the transatlantic slave trade, right? What continued in terms of knowledge and practices, but also attention to adaptation and creativity. So I'm assuming that there is already knowledge, right? And while this may sound like yes, because we're in a decolonizing global health conversation right now, in so much, oh, sorry, I got excited there. In so much scholarship, research, public discourse, news media, the emphasis continues to be on Black lack of knowledge, right? Botanical or ecological. I wanted to share this map because not everyone maybe is familiar with the diaspora, right? And so as a diaspora scholar, giving a sense of, number one, resources that are available to talk about these kinds of topics, and number two, a sense of what I'm talking about here. So the scope of what I'm talking about is really descendants and legacies of the transatlantic slave trade in the context of what are now called the Americas, right, on mainstream maps. What I appreciate about this map from slavevoyages.org, which does an excellent job of sharing visuals, maps, research, databases, tracing the voyages, tracing how many Africans were enslaved, how many arrived and made it across the crossings. Really excellent resource, and I'll include that in the further resources that I share with you after this talk too. What I appreciate about this map is there is a sense of that global context beyond the Atlantic alone. So remembering together that the slave trade out of Africa was also within Africa, to Asia, to India, to Europe, in addition to crossing the Atlantic. However, and the scope of what I'm talking about here, when I say diaspora, I'm really thinking about Black diaspora in the United States context, in Mexico specifically in this talk, and study those Americas. Which leads to another assumption, right? Assuming that there are philosophies here. So when we're talking about knowledge, breaking that down, I'm thinking of onto-epistemologies. I feel like ontology and epistemologies are words that are used so very often and perhaps overused in our contemporary moment in academic literature. So I want to highlight what I mean by that here. By onto-epistemologies, I'm thinking about worldviews and ways of knowing, and how in the context of the Black diaspora and botanical knowledge, these are reimagined, cultivated, and applied, especially amid injustice, whether we're talking about environmental justice, injustice, climate injustice. Undergirding all of this is racial injustice, racial capitalism, isms in general, right? And I'm really thinking with the work of Black ecology scholars, such amazing work, such inspiring work. I really consider this the work of the future in many senses of the word, by J.T. Rome, Danielle Purifoy, Justin Hosby, among other scholar activists. So just a reminder here that this is important, and I'm making these explicit, I'm drawing them out, because they counter conventional assumptions about Black diaspora botanical knowledge, ecological knowledge, perpetuated in multiple respects, right? Let's go to Black ecologies for a moment, and I'll just read this quote out loud, and I might have to shift my camera just a little bit for a moment. On one hand, Black ecologies provides a way of historicizing and analyzing the ongoing reality that Black communities in the US South and in the wider Black diaspora, African diaspora, are most susceptible to the effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels, subsidence, sinking land, as well as the ongoing effects of toxic stewardship, the ongoing effects of environmental injustice. On the other hand, Black ecologies names the corpus, the body of insurgent knowledge produced by these same communities, which they hold as the authors as having bearing on how we should even be historicizing the current climate crisis, among others, and how we conceive of futures outside of destruction. This is a powerful quote. If you see me present before, I probably presented with this quote before. Probably will be doing it for years to come, right? But giving a sense of Black ecologies and what is meant here. A lot of Black ecology scholarship works closely and moves closely with Black geographies as well. If you're not familiar with geography scholarship, such a rich subfield body of work in Black geographies, which also holds the oppressions, but acknowledges that that is not all there is. Right? What kind of hope can we have if that is all there is? Right? There's also attention to the agency, the aliveness, the resistance, the thriving at the same time. And I would say in my work, I probably lean more towards entering through the resistance and the thriving, right? For my own well-being, and also because I'm so very interested in that thriving. Highlighting that when we're talking then about Black ecologies, and what interests me, inspires me in this work, is that there's this addressing of the injustice And there's this naming and the centering of the knowledge, resistance, and thriving. And what I often find, not only in the theoretical work, but also in the theories in academic theory, but also in the theories generated by practitioners, organizers, traditional healers, root workers, conjurers, right, with whom I'm working, learning, talking, is that there are these relational ways of knowing that might be familiar to those of us who study traditional or indigenous knowledges or who came up with that knowledge. Right? Relational ways of knowing in terms of plants, people, plants and nature, plants as being agentic or having agency. The ways in which these relational ways of knowing serve contemporary well-being for Black communities and beyond, and the future are of particular interest to me and very much resonant in, and I feel invoked in Black Ecologies work. Just talking about it reminds me of what's possible. So let's turn a bit to this Afro-Mexican context and research that I did before, right? With that Black Ecologies kind of point, with entering in through this frame, with what I acknowledged about how I initially practiced research and how I'm not that excited about how I used to practice research. Acknowledging again, here's a rooftop garden in the Afro-Mexican context, Central Veracruz from 2007, 2008. Since this time, Afro-Mexicans, as some of you may know, have gained recognition on the census. They weren't recognized on the national census. There are so many questions to ask about what recognition means, what it brings. Does recognition hold governments and institutions accountable? What kind of labor and mobilization is necessary to do that work? So this plant knowledge is still taking place and being cultivated in ways that I'm so excited to continue to learn about. But now, not on communities, as I kind of feel like I was practicing before, but more so with communities. Some of the questions that I'm asking here, so this is where I'm talking more about the meta. What is at stake when publishing botanical knowledge? So much of us who do this research are asking these questions. Right? So many of us. How does that knowledge gathering serve the community? What about partnerships with local organizations who are archiving community knowledge and history in the first place? Are there ways to study plant knowledge and lift up Black botanical medicine beyond extractive methods? This one continues to inform my work and research. I want to highlight a few ways that those questions, and especially that highlight one, that these are really inspiring my research now. So I'm still moving in this diasporic sense, right? And again, returning to Afro-Mexican gardens and context, and with more respect and reverence, I hope, than before. So for example, I'm currently reconnecting with local organizations to share my thesis and really seeking ways to publish my thesis in Spanish. Side note, if you know folks who do this translation work, please let me know, because I would really, really like to share that thesis in Spanish. It's got parts in Espanol, but mostly it's in English. I'm analyzing discourse. So something that I sometimes forget as a social scientist, I sometimes forget my humanistic roots. You know, I can actually analyze archives and text as well, right? So I'm remembering this as another source of information, as another way to practice decolonial methods. So I'm looking at discourse related to contemporary Afro-Mexican recognition, and also vulnerabilities of Afro-Mexican communities on the western and eastern coastlines of Mexico, where most Afro-Mexican populations currently reside, in terms of climate and justice. And what does botanical medicine look like in that context as well? I wanted to touch on briefly, I won't go super deep into it, but we can reach into it for Q&A, on the autoethnographic practice as well. So something that also happened, remember I said I was just really happy to find Black folks in Mexico. I mean, that was really what it felt like. It was like a homecoming. It was like, oh my gosh, family. And there were ways in which I certainly, yes, there were identity connections, coordinates that were shared between community members and I. And at the same time, I'm from the United States context, right? I didn't struggle with having running water as community members did have, right? I'm from the global North, not the global South. So there are these complexities. And so in the interest of really practicing Black, Chicana, and Indigenous feminisms through inner work in the research, I also have been turning to more ritual-based and arts-based scholarship in this sense. And this is a piece that I've made thinking through and feeling through my own positionality as a Black and Black Chicana researcher. How this connects with the broader research of Afro-Mexican botanical knowledge, I'm still exploring, but you'll notice there's corn on the edges. So I work deeply with corn in thinking about corn as a botanical guide, as a botanical ancestor, and also in terms of global production of corn. So many things going on there. A brief snapshot as well. So in terms of how the work is moving now, I'm also very interested in the United States context in the sense of migration. So as Naomi mentioned, my current book project is much more about the Great Migration, another map, right? This movement of almost 6 million African Americans to the northwest, northeast, from about 1900s, 1910s through the 1970s. This is the early wave of the Great Migration, 6 million. So when talking about the Great Migration, I'm especially interested in, especially after living in Milwaukee, a destination of the Great Migration, I'm especially interested in Black botanical knowledge and how it has traveled over time. So this again brings me to hopefully some decolonial methods working with archives, pictures, art, like Jacob Lawrence's migration series, and also back to ethnobotanical methods or botanical methods, like collecting plants from gardens, right? Working closely with fellow cultural workers and traditional practitioners, interviews, these kinds of methods for understanding that migration. And I should say, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the knowledge among the descendants of the Great Migration. So those who may have had grandma, right, go to Chicago or Detroit or LA or Oakland, and are now perhaps growing their own gardens in those same areas. I'm going to pause there. How are we? Because we're about to shift one more time. You with me? Folks with me? Okay. I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay. Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Brianna, I'm so excited to hear your beautiful name. And Naomi, okay. The Black Botany Studio at UCSC. So everything I just shared with you is really now under the Black Botany Studio, AKA my research lab at UC Santa Cruz. And here's a little bit about what this lab/platform is about. Okay? It's about this research that I just shared with you, and really that creative inquiry into Black botanical knowledge, past and present. It exists to archive, lift up, and theorize Black botanical knowledge, with an emphasis on the significance of this knowledge for local communities and in the global context of climate change, global Black Lives Matter movement, COVID-19 pandemic, that context, that critical global context, critical global health context. Right? You all are witnessing for the first time the logo in progress as well, so claps, right? Welcome to the studio. I want to give you a sense of what this is looking like. So I mentioned some of the arts-based methods that I practiced before, such as participatory film, altar making, and ritual work, especially as an autoethnographic practice. And then through the Black Botany Studio, partnering with amazing artist Jennifer Steverson in the left-hand corner, sometimes by Zoom. Jennifer's in Texas, and also due to our COVID-19 context at the time too. We had this Zoom workshop where Jennifer taught us about dyeing with marigold flower, and also her practice as a Black botanical artist, textile artist, independent scholar with plants and botanical materials, from sourcing those materials to how to work with them in these ways. So each of the students received kits, right? They brought them home and they dyed with marigold flower. And look at the result, this really gorgeous, beautiful yellow tone. Right? Here's a little bit more about Jennifer Steverson, and I'll share this with you too as part of further resources. But just giving you a sense of how part of Black botanical medicine, as I've learned it, practiced it, studied it, has very much been about community building. And the studio and lab work is also about connecting with activists, independent scholars who aren't necessarily within the academy in a traditional way. And Jennifer is an example of someone who moves in this really creative way as an independent scholar. And so she was a virtual artist scholar with us for this past year. Really grateful for her and to her work. I'll end with this slide. So what is going on here with the Black Botany Studio is not only research and platform and community building, but also related to some work I have published on critical and embodied pedagogy before, and really interested in still publishing and being there. Right? How do we imagine teaching about Black botanical medicine, decolonizing global health in classrooms or in other learning contexts? And something that I continue to practice, learn more about, hone, articulate, theorize is really critical and embodied pedagogy. Critical in the sense of not only what are the historical power dynamics, but who are the students and who am I learning about this topic? This is very different from here's Black botanical medicine. Here it is. This is how am I also implicated in the study of use of understanding of Black botanical medicine. This is what is mine to do as a student, colleague, educator in terms of Black botanical medicine. There's a sense of implication and an invitation into the context, right? With care. I'm not talking about appropriating the medicine, but I am talking about addressing power dynamics. And then the embodied in terms of dying with marigold, right? The embodied in terms of through class assignments, and even in methods through my projects, paying attention to sensations and feelings, to the ways of knowing that are so central often to Black botanical medicine, ways of knowing like connecting with ancestors, if that's something that students also want to explore in the classroom, they have space to do that, or just connecting with their breath or their body. And arts-based assignments are often part of this decolonial pedagogy too. Lastly, I'll highlight that pedagogy is something that I'm practicing in the studio. It's something I practice in the classes that I teach. And it very much comes from being a cultural worker and researcher as well, kind of that axis, that crossroads that I've shared with you. I'm going to close there. These are my office hours, but really this is for my students. But if you would like to drop in for my office hours, feel free. And here's my email as well. I'll stop there, you all. I'm excited for Q&A.
Thanks, Naya. Really great to hear your perspectives. And I particularly appreciated the thoughtfulness of your presentation and the importance of elevating insurgent knowledge and thinking about practices that move beyond sort of extractive research. If it's okay, I'd love to kind of kick off the discussion with a question. Before I do that, let me just invite others here. We want to make this as discursive as possible. Please, if you have a question, share it with Naomi or I, and then we can invite you to come off mute and share your question. But Naya, if I may, I just want to speak to this issue of epistemology. Your work centers around Black epistemology, and in the context of your discipline in geography, yes, so much of epistemology is defined by whiteness and how we understand the world through a white lens, and even how that relates to Black geographies. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways in which that Black epistemology, that Black way of knowing, is marginalized by the predominant knowledge frameworks that are out there, and then more specifically, how do we dismantle the sort of epistemic injustice that results from that? And I think that's relevant to my work as a health researcher. I mean, I have examples from my own space where we continue to marginalize the Ayurvedic practices around health, and sort of elevate biomedical approaches to health in Africa in a way that I think perpetuates injustices. Yeah, please, if you will, share your thoughts on how we move beyond those kind of approaches.
Yeah, the way, and I really appreciate this question, Mike, and some of the ways that I notice the marginalization and even erasure of the epistemologies, especially Black epistemologies, histories, right, like presence, is often through the way that even what could potentially expand, say, understanding of biomedicine, that connecting with sensations, the body, ancestors, right, is not part of the scientific, considered part of the scientific method or measurable or evidence. And yet what might be learned, right, through these ways of knowing that are considered not only extremely important to people, and it's not only that I practice and that, yes, I feel like my ancestors are here right now, and it's not just that that is what's significant, it literally matters in the context of people's lives, like in terms of what they buy, in terms of where they go, in terms of their physiological response, right? We know this from mindfulness research, which I've been somewhat engaged with. We know this from research on racial trauma and stress and hypervigilance, right? There is such powerful research about the importance of ceremony for communities of color and storytelling. Oh, and altar building. I'll have to share that research with you all if you haven't seen it. For Latinx communities, for example, in the context of well-being. And I'm feeling like this surge of energy around this because it can't be discounted enough. And even if the spirituality, the religious, ancestral aspects of it aren't taken seriously, what about the fact that these materialize, right? Through and with the body, materialize in health in different ways. And if you're ingesting a tea, well, you're taking it into your body, right? So at least there are so many opportunities that are missed when there is an insistence on treating anything outside of the Western biomedical paradigm as lesser than or lacking knowledge or a superstition, right? All of these terms, and stigmatization as well, especially with African traditional religions, really deep stigmatization. So the recentering then, the epistemic work, the part that I'm excited about, remember the thriving piece, I think really is about even moving from that place of this is knowledge, right? To just working from and through the knowledge. This is a bit of an art and a craft. And who inspires me in this way is Toni Morrison's work. Toni Morrison so often talked about how she wanted to write through and with and from Black community, not about Black community. And I often think about that. And so this is why you hear me also exploring in the classroom these different ways of knowing together, because they're so central to Black epistemologies that I encounter in research, and also, yes, that I also practice, right? And so I think that that centering is important. While Mike, as you're saying, acknowledging that this minimizing has been very, very real, right? And in one of the pieces that I write too, the last thing I'll add, when I talk about slow violence, there's a piece where slow violence in Black food geographies. There's a way in which Rob Nixon, who theorizes wonderfully and beautifully slow violence, also says that it's not visible. But the question is not visible to whom, right? To whom is that violence of the pollution, the environmental injustice not evident? To whom is food apartheid not evident? And this is that other way of making the epistemic shift, is saying, okay, who is seeing and bearing witness and living this? And how do we center those voices? No matter our positionality as researchers and resources, how do we center those voices and that knowledge?
I really appreciate that perspective. And speaking to issues around climate change, I think a challenge is that oftentimes we don't see in the global north the profound deleterious impacts of our practices on climate, because so often they're happening elsewhere in the world, right? And so providing that voice to those communities, I think it's part of what I hear you talking about, at least in sort of addressing, or decolonizing, issues around climate justice. Yeah. I'd love to kind of ask you or invite a question rather from one of our audience around pedagogy. I'm really interested by this form of embodied pedagogy. But Stacey had a question. Stacey, do you want to come off mute and share your question with Naya?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, my name is Stacey Hagan, and I'm with the Education Abroad program. And my question is, well, thank you first and foremost for this really amazing and such engaging talk. I just feel like there's such a wonderful niche and so much to be explored through your work. And it sounds like for the studio, it is kind of, you're finding your roots and getting the students, and the good work and word is starting to spread. So I'm curious about how what your goals and thoughts are with connecting with either more students at Santa Cruz or within the UC system, or do you have any further goals to help promote this kind of idea and project through, maybe you're from Mexico or with other people doing this kind of work? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stacey. Great to have someone grounded in education here too. Yes, so I'm very much newer to the UC system and to UC Santa Cruz. And I really started, I know newer, but it's interesting, right? Because I started during the pandemic and I've really been here. So it's like, it's been 2 years, but how much time has it been, right? So I'm still very much building relationships. I would love to talk more with folks on other campuses. Naomi and I have had great conversations so far too, really excited to keep talking there. I'm really interested in reaching out and working with students at different campuses. One of the goals of the Black Botany Studio too, to make this more explicit, is to diversify, and I use that word with intention, right? Not just diversity of representation, but diversify critically botany and the study of plants, and especially Black diaspora botany, because I've so often been one of the few Black researchers doing the work. We have more Black researchers now, and even researchers of color, but similar to how there are moves for more Indigenous Native American botanists, right, and ethnobotanical scholarship, really thinking through this in Black botanical scholarship since too. So a lot of the students who took part in that workshop came from diverse BIPOC backgrounds. We also had students who identified as white. And in that intake, giving a sense, Stacey, of kind of maybe what that reaching out and building out might look like, I do ask students to give a sense of their background, their racial identity. It's optional, right? Careful about public guidelines and rules, but really giving a sense of how they racially identify, and also what kind of knowledge they bring to the space. Why do they want to be in that workshop? And how I frame that, in case this is interesting pedagogically too, is I frame it as, this is an anti-racist pedagogical space. This is a space promoting anti-oppression work. So we want to understand who's going to be in the space, because that helps us facilitate in a much more intentional way. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that. Linnea, I think, has a question for you. Linnea, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Oh, sure. Hi, Naya. Thank you so much for talking with us. I really loved hearing all of the things you were saying, and then my brain just like exploded with awesomeness when you talked about dying with plants. I just went to I just bought a bunch of plants that dye stuff. So anyways, that's not the question. The question was, what are some, it sounds like you've really looked into different geographical spaces and talked to a lot of people, but I'm just curious, what are some creative ways you've heard or seen Afro-Mexicana gardeners or Black gardeners cultivating plants and sharing knowledge in specifically the North American diaspora? What are some creative ways you've seen that happen? Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm still growing into, so it's interesting, my work with especially Afro-Mexicana folk has mainly been in Mexico rather than the United States context. I will say that research with Afro-Latinx and Afro-Mexican populations in the United States is much needed, right? Especially critical kinds of research. What I'm seeing, Linnea, maybe you've seen this as well, in terms of health, is that health outcomes, to use a word I can't find a better word right now, but the health outcomes for Afro-Latinx folks in the United States context are sometimes worse than those for African-American populations, and definitely often worse than lighter skin. So there's a lot of research about lighter skin Latinx communities and darker skin, usually actually using those terms, right? So the health outcomes are also worse for darker skin Latinx folks, Indigenous, Afro-descendant, otherwise, yes. So there's a lot to explore there. I will say that I had an early proposal about Afro-Mexican migrants in Chicago that wasn't funded years ago. And I've been thinking of returning to that and seeing if there may be ways to connect with folks, learn with folks, but most importantly, support what people are already doing and what knowledge is already there. What I do know, the one thing I will share is I know that people share knowledge across distance. So sometimes, especially if people have migrated, they're asking their moms, like, so for example, in Veracruz, about certain remedies. And often it was men who are migrating. So they're calling back, asking their moms, their abuelas, their abuelitas, grandmothers about certain remedies that they can then access, say, in Chicago, or if they're in North Carolina, or if they're in Florida. So this is really interesting. And this gets into migrant ethnobotany, really rich and interesting body of work that's really been growing too.
One more question, and then we probably have to wrap up if that's okay. And it builds on what you've been talking about in terms of sort of pedagogy. You know, so much of how we do education is framed by the dominant practices of health professions, and they in themselves are rooted in colonial practices, and as a consequence, we inadvertently perpetuate sort of harmful framing perspectives and you know, oppress the voices of marginalized populations. I love this notion of sort of embodied pedagogy. Do you have any other kind of models for how we can decolonize the way that we educate across health professions education, Naya?
Yeah, I think that there's so much to unpack there, and I'm really grateful to have had the postdoc. So it was a T32. Those of you who are deep in NIH language, right? Yeah, it was a T32 kind of training grant postdoc in a primary care department. So I really got to understand even more about how medicine is working and what people are also doing to transform medicine, right? Which is quite a challenge to work within the system, in any system. And medicine is its whole other thing, which Mike is talking about. One point I would like to highlight that immediately comes up is careful with, so sometimes what I noticed in medical education settings, these kinds of case study kind of model that's used, sometimes focusing stereotypically on and with communities. So say, there's a Black elder who comes to your office. What will you do with them? Here's what Black people usually believe. So I want to be really careful about the cultural competency model and really dismantling that as part of decolonial practice and really decolonizing teaching. I appreciate the work of Jonathan Metzl, right, in structural competency quite a bit. I think there's also been a lot of work, if some of you haven't heard of that before. I think there's also been a lot of work, and it's very pedagogical. So Jonathan Metzl and colleague, cannot remember the second colleague's name, the second author, so I'll share that piece too. They really talk about emphasizing structure, right, in the context of medical and health education and what that might look like. I will say that I think there are already and have long been pieces, works in critical race theory that are also useful to bring into the health professions and medicine. And I think some of the embodied practices, and I'll share some of the work that I published on that too, can be really useful in the classroom. So some of the things I've done with teenagers, just like sensory kinds of things, move from that intellectual space alone, not that senses aren't intellectual and involve analysis, but they move into other ways of knowing and remind future doctors, health profession administrators, you know, different nurses, right, that they have bodies, right? Right? Quite honestly, that they have bodies. And this is so important too, because of burnout in the health professions. I know that that's not a structural term to use, in terms of that because of the systems, how they're set up, but really paying attention to those ways of caring for oneself is also useful. And then there's such interesting, research on mindfulness and teaching and medicine and pedagogy too. So that came to mind. I'll have to share all of these.
Yes. I know you're going to share resources. I think I'm getting lots of questions from people on how do we follow your work? How do we stay up to date with what you're doing? And so I think sharing some of the resources would be amazing, but also maybe throwing in the website for your studio, or
Sure.
if you have other,
Yes.
resources out there for how folks can stay up on the work that you're doing. I think folks would love that opportunity. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like, Linnea, just my brain is going a lot of different directions. I have so many strands of really good food for thought and things that I just want to sit with some more for myself and reflect on. So thanks for opening that conversation up for us and joining us in our speaker series. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I have one quick thing to share. I
Yeah.
was thinking just about what Mike said too about the global north. And Mike and all, one thing I do think about is communities that are very aware of flooding or pollution, right? And the proximity of Black communities to the sources of climate change. So thinking through that, and there are some really important resources for thinking through the global north in that way too, critically, in terms of what you were saying, in terms of climate change and awareness and who is aware and who knows. But thank you all. I felt like I really wanted to make sure I added that piece. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Stacy, Maya, Linnea. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Take care, guys.
Thank you. Bye.